Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Vraks, where after years of stalemate and barely any progress being made, finally the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army stands at the very brink of victory. Due to the heroic intervention of the Red Scorpions chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, the breach in the Vraxian curtain walls was finally carried. The 11th Assault Corps was then able to pour through and establish a foothold on the other side of the curtain walls, finally bringing the Vraxian citadel itself within striking range of the 88th. This forced the enemy to react quickly and drastically. No longer could their extended line outside of the curtain walls be held. It was simply too risky, because if they lost control of the citadel, they would lose access to virtually all of the command and control capabilities on Vraks, leaving the traitor armies as little more than scattered bands of renegades, easy prey for the invading army. And so, once more, the Vraxian traitors found themselves in a position where they had to call for a general retreat from their front line. But this time, it would be a true retreat. The first time the Vraxians found themselves in need of abandoning their front lines, it was as a part of a scheme, a plan long in the making, and with months upon months of preliminary preparations and planning. The second time, it was an unfortunate withdrawal, but still one that had been planned for. Contingencies had been made, although not to the standards of the first withdrawal. But this time, there were no plans, there were no contingencies, there were no preparations made. It would simply be a mad dash towards the rear. And Emperor take the hindmost. There was, however, one ray of sunshine in this rather dreary situation for the defenders. The Red Scorpions had arrived rather abruptly. They had also made their plans in secret, not feeling the need to consult overmuch with the Death Corps of Krieg or Marshal Kagori. And when their plans were presented to everyone else involved, they expected those plans to be executed immediately and without delay. This, of course, had its advantages. The poor defenders had no way of knowing what was coming, and were caught completely by surprise when the Red Scorpions launched a blitzkrieg-style assault upon the breach, seizing it, reinforcing it, and fortifying it, all before the Vraxians really knew what had hit them. And this element of surprise, combined with the overwhelming might of the God Emperor's Astartes, was no small portion of why the plan had been a success in the first place. But it also meant that there was precious little time, if any, for Marshal Kagori to marshal the rest of his forces. As such, there was no grand plan on behalf of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army as a whole to exploit the situation created by the seizing of the breach point. The various line corps were not ready for a general offensive. They were not prepared to increase the intensity of their forward maneuvers to catch a retreating enemy, and the other assault corps also was not prepared to initiate a rapid pursuit of the enemy. This meant that whilst the Vraxians had to retreat in an unorganized, pell-mell fashion, the Death Corps' pursuit of the retreating Vraxians was just as unorganized and poorly executed. And so, once again, the Vraxian defenders managed to slip away out of the grasp of their Imperial pursuers. This had been yet another chance to end the war on Vraks in one swift, decisive blow, but unfortunately, the nature of the intervention that had finally broken open the breach, the very cause for the retreat in the first place, was of the Astartes variant, and the God Emperor's angels rarely feel the need to inform their mortal brethren about the peculiarities of their commitments. It is, however, hard to criticize the Scorpions overmuch. They had managed to achieve something that the 88th had not. They had taken the army one step closer to victory, and one could hardly deny the fact that they did, at the moment, appear to have been the decisive factor. So what if the victory had not been as overwhelmingly one-sided as it could have been? So what if it had not ended the war in one fell stroke? It had, after all, secured victory. Or so, at least, Marshal Kagori thought. Just as a frightened and distraught-looking young aide rushed into his office and informed the Marshal that he had a visitor waiting to see him. As you can probably imagine, this is somewhat unusual. You, generally speaking, don't just wander into the audience hall of an Imperial High Commander, especially not in the middle of an active campaign, various security threats and whatnot. And yet, this guest had not only found himself rather suddenly in the audience chamber, he had also done so without the Marshal receiving any kind of advanced notification. The Marshal was not expecting visitors, and again, Lord Marshals tend to get updated on whether or not they have somebody they need to meet during any given day. And so, naturally somewhat perplexed, the Marshal inquired of his aide who precisely this person was, and by what right he thought he could enter into an Imperial General Headquarters and demand to see the man in charge. The envoy, clearly quite uncomfortable with the whole situation, informed the Marshal that the visitor claimed to be a representative of the Emperor's most holy Inquisition, and that he did not expect to be kept waiting. I can only imagine that Marshal Arnim Kagori's face at that moment must have been a most peculiar mix of incredulity, confusion, and probably just a hint of fear as well. The God Emperor's most holy Inquisition is not known for making social calls, and so if an Inquisitor had showed up at his doorstep unannounced, that probably meant that something rather serious was going on. The Marshal was also a bit worried because he knew that the Inquisition had been in opposition to him taking command of the siege of Vraks. And whilst the God Emperor's Inquisition usually tries to play nice with the other major power brokers of the Imperium, it was certainly possible that they had simply gotten sick of him and had come to ensure that the position at Imperial General Headquarters was vacated by any means necessary. Now, of course, such a one-sided and marginally hostile action would be viewed with some disdain by the Adeptus Ministorum and Administratum, but that didn't mean that it wasn't well within the Inquisition's power. And so it was an undoubtedly nervous Marshal Kagori that hastened to the audience hall next to his equally, if not even more so, nervous adjutant. And when they entered the room, I doubt their nerves settled any further, as they entered into a most unique gathering. There were several apparently feral warriors filling the room, adorned with various primitive tribal fetishes. And even more frightening was the sickly, emaciated man, clad in heavy, billowing robes, standing in the middle of the room. The man whom all the massively muscled barbarian warriors took care to stay at least 5 steps away from at any given time. And concealing the empty eye sockets of the thin man was a pure white piece of cloth with a golden aquila embroidered onto it. If there had been any doubt, then that last item of clothing removed all of it. This was a high-ranking Imperial astropath, a member of the Navis Nobilitae and one of its upper echelons, an organization that rivaled even the Administratum for power within the Imperium. And the worst part was that he was clearly not the most powerful individual in the room. If Kagori had had any doubts as to the veracity of his aide's claim that an Imperial Inquisitor was waiting for him, the sight of this man would remove it instantly. And I say man because it was hard to consider him a mere mortal. He towered head and shoulders above even the massively muscled barbarians who made up his entourage. The Inquisitor had the physique of a space marine. He was wearing magnificently tailored clothing, all shimmering silks and threaded gold trimmed with brilliantly white fur. And yet, for all of the apparent quality, the ensemble looked almost comical on him, his colossal physique seemingly threatening to burst out of his finery even as he stood at rest, like a giant of myth encapsulated in a gossamer-thin web of civility. The giant had to lean forward to proffer a hand the size of a dinner platter towards the Marshal for him to shake. The Inquisitor then introduced himself as Lord Hector Vraks, Protector General of the Scarus Conclave. And if the good Marshal was not currently preoccupied wondering whether or not the monster would now crush his hand and proceed to behead him in his own audience chamber, he may have noticed a couple things there. First and foremost, Hector introduced himself as a lord, and a Protector General on top of that. Marshal Kagori's elevated position might have allowed him some knowledge of the inner workings of the Inquisition, or at the very least, their rank structure. An Inquisitor is a person that wields unimaginable power within the Imperium. They can essentially do whatever they please with anything and anyone at any time for any reason. Their power is essentially limitless. But even within the Inquisition, there are those with even more power. To put it simply, a Lord Inquisitor is, to a regular Inquisitor, what an Inquisitor is to the regular population of the Imperium. Or in other words, a source of quite literally limitless authority. And his second title, that of Protector General of the Scarus Conclave, means that even amongst other Lord Inquisitors, he is the supreme authority on all matters of a military nature within the Scarus sector. This all means that, right now, Marshal Kagori, whether he was aware of it or not, was shaking hands with quite literally the most powerful man in the entire sector. Which naturally begs the question, what was he doing here? And that is where the bad news really started to come pouring forth. Hector was indeed not on a social call. He was here to subsume the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army into the Ordo Malus. This, he stated, was an unavoidable necessity, since both the army and the entire planet was in dire peril. Something that must have confused the Marshal a little bit, because according to his charts and battle plans, the 88 was doing better than in a long time. They had once again managed to encircle the enemy's armies with their backs to the deep gorges, and with the enemy being forced to retreat hurriedly and in an almost panicked fashion to reinforce the remaining curtain walls and the citadel itself, the 88th had been able to make considerable gains and had even almost managed to push through the defenders and split them in half. Unfortunately, the forward momentum of the first line corps, which had appeared oh so promising to begin with, was starting to slow as they ran into yet further and tighter concentration of Nurgle forces. Additionally, the land they had to traverse was becoming more and more hostile. It was starting to resemble more and more the hellish landscape that the 30th Line Corps had had to cross to continue the advance. But, as of yet, the hope of splitting the enemy army completely in two was not yet lost. Death Rider and light armored patrols, both from the 1st Line Corps and the 34th Line Corps, were constantly trying to find weaknesses in the enemy's positions in an attempt to meet up with one another and facilitate a full breakthrough on the enemy's southern fronts. And the good news didn't stop there. The rapid advance had brought the 88th into striking range of several more underground armories. Whilst these armories were all fortified to resist attacks even from directly above them, they were now unable to gain further reinforcements from the citadel, or rely upon extra troops sallying out from the curtain walls to relieve them. The 88th decided that now that they had all the time in the world to deal with these underground fortresses, it was time for some vengeance. And after the failed break-in at Armory 5546, Imperial High Command was aware that most of the valuable equipment had either been used up or moved to the armories directly beneath the citadel itself. This meant that as far as Imperial General Headquarters was concerned, there was nothing but enemies within those bunkers. And this allowed the Death Corps engineers to partake in a particularly horrifying form of retribution. The Death Corps engineers, armed with welders, sealed shut all entrances to the bunkers, blasted open every ventilation shaft, and filled it with permacrete. And once the armory was completely sealed airtight, the engineers drilled a single hole in the permacrete down into one of the main ventilation shafts. They then slowly and carefully guided a specially constructed tube down the hole and began pumping the bunker full of TP3. The hundreds, if not thousands, of Vraxian defenders left in the underground bunker would all die, choking on their own blood, as the highly corrosive gas filled every single nook and cranny of the underground armory. Even if the enemy sealed themselves shut behind massive blast doors, it was only a question of time, and a question of whether or not the defenders would run out of oxygen first, or if the TP3 would eat its way through the massive blast doors. Those with any wit left to do so would end themselves with their own weapons. Those too far gone, through insanity brought on by a worship of the ruinous gods, would be reduced slowly and painfully to nothing more than slag heaps of melted viscous flesh and bone. The Death Corps engineers had sworn their vengeance upon Underground Armory 5546, and they had most certainly got their vengeance. This scene was repeated in every single underground armory seized by the Death Corps of Krieg, for the Corps never does anything by halves. And so, as you can clearly see, the Imperials appeared to be winning. From where Marshal Kagori was standing, it appeared as if victory now was only a question of time, and not a whole lot of time either. As soon as the citadel had been reduced, what remained could be mopped up easily and at the 88th's leisure. And yet, the Lord Inquisitor was telling him otherwise. And not only that, Lord Hector Rex was informing Marshal Kagori that not only was his army not at the very precipice of victory, it stood instead unsteadily at the edge of a yawning abyss. All of this was A bit much for the Marshal to take in all at once. But we, of course, know something that the Marshal does not. We know what was in the mind of Hector Rex. He had long now been consulting the Emperor's tarot, and consulting with his various seers, and attempting to read the ebbs and flows of potential futures. And everyone had arrived at the exact same conclusion. The Chaos Worshippers on Vraks was preparing for a ritual of near unprecedented scale. They were preparing to offer up the entire planet and everyone on it to the ruinous powers. And in so doing, they would quite literally pull the planet partially into the warp. In preparation for doing so, they would carry out several smaller rituals, including mass sacrifices and rituals of possession, where the citizenry of Vraks would be herded out into the streets and massacred in vast numbers so as to draw the gaze of the Densians of the Warp. Demons would then be coaxed into possessing the still fresh corpses of the civilian population, and soon thereafter, hordes of demonic entities would roam the streets, ripping and tearing apart the rest of the civilian population, and offering them up as well to their ever-thirsting gods. And as a part of the preparation for this massive ritual, which would turn the entire citadel of Vraks into nothing so much as one vast charnel house with demons capering and dancing through the streets, the ruinous powers' more loyal servants would be offering their own bodies up for possession as well. As if hordes of traitor legionnaires were not bad enough, the Imperials would soon have to face possessed Chaos Space Marines. And according to Lord Hector's agents, already placed within the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, this preliminary phase of the ritual was already underway. The Chaos Sorcerers were busy tearing as many and as large holes into the warp as possible all across the Vraxian surface, and the efforts of the Nurgle worshippers in particular in poisoning the land now stood revealed for its true malicious purpose. In poisoning the very planet itself, the worshippers of the Plague God was making the very land itself inviting for his most favoured servants. The apparently immaterial claims and reports constantly filed by the 30th and 1st Line Corps, talking about flickering lights and shadows moving out in the desolated, plague-ridden, swampish hellscape outside their trenches, were all about to become horrifically real. As out there, beyond the Death Corps' lines, the dead had already begun to stir. And on that exceedingly diabolical note, I will leave you once more. We're on the home stretch now, boys, as the next episode will be the first in the third and final book about the war on Vraks. It has been a massive series so far, and yet the final showdown and end to the siege is yet just ahead of us. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.